Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning to those of you in earlier time zones, and good evening if there's also someone joining from a more distant, farthest time zone than ours here in Europe. Thank you really very much for your attendance. Just reminding you all that this session will be recorded, so all of those that could not join will receive the recordings later. It's really a very big pleasure for me to have this second series of ESG webinar series that we Nivalion, so Simon and I and Alice, we are hosting with Voss and Partners in Austria, Dr. Herfried Voss, and also Christian Carvajal. The first series focused a lot on supply chain issues, and we were discussing regulations such as the CSDDD, the CSRD, all those word soups, and related disputes in the field of supply chain. Now, this new series, we're gonna address a whole new breadth of topics from the formulation and prosecution of ESG claims to the latest updates and empirical research in such topics. We'll, of course, touch upon the impact of the coming wave of climate litigation, as put by a famous news outlet recently. And in our session today, we're going to be talking about fighting the good fight. As the title goes, we'll first start from the trenches of the fight. Johannes WESEMANN will be talking about how he has been bringing a strategic and results-oriented approach from the private sector into All Rise, an NGO that believes and firmly believes in seeking societal changes through legal systems. They do so by serving as an incubator for creating measurable and favorable climate impact through litigation. All Rise has attracted the world's attention by bringing helping to bring the so-called case The Planet versus Bolsonaro before the International Criminal Court for his potential crimes against humanity resulting from deforestation in the Amazon rainforest. I must say that as a Brazilian, legal actions that seek to protect the Amazon rainforest are certainly welcome. After Johannes, we'll have Zora, dear friend of mine, who will be talking about corporate governance much beyond the G element. That is really her starting point to address how securities laws and regulation in Brazil connect with the ESG framework as part of this interdependent law enforcement system. How has the scope of the fiduciary duty of administrators changed over time to encompass those factors? What are the pressure points shareholders are pushing, and how are capital market players acting as watchdogs to prevent and restrain companies' misbehaviors, such as greenwashing, corruption, and the failure to adjust to net zero emission targets? So Zora will be discussing some important initiatives, such as upcoming bills on private enforcement and whistleblowers initiatives, and regulation on disclosure of ESG elements and best practices. Finally, we will have Andreas HÖSLI addressing the whys and hows of corporate climate litigation. So he'll be discussing some landmark cases brought against states, companies, and their directors and officers, a recent trend we have been observing in the ESG litigation field. I take also the chance to ask you, have you ever heard of concepts such as private climate litigation? So if not, please stay tuned to hear from the author of the definition himself, Andreas. And with that, I pass the baton to my ESG partner here at Nivalion, Simon Knupfer. Please, Simon.
Many thanks, Lucas, and I have the pleasure to introduce you to Johannes WESEMANN. Having grown up in Vienna and Hong Kong, Johannes spent many years in the media business before he then founded an advisory company, and then he became general manager of Uber in Austria. 2 years ago, Johannes started Allrise, what Lucas already mentioned. Allrise is an organization that takes legal action against climate and environmental offenders. And Johannes, we are very happy to have you here and look forward to hearing more about the work of Allrise.
Well, thank you very much for that invitation. I just jump in. I hear there are mainly legal specialists here, so I'm coming again from the private sector. But I did collect a lot of experience in the past 3 years when we started this fight or this sort of organization, Allrise. Yeah, I have the pleasure here to speak about this topic, pain points and solutions in developing ESG claims. My focus is here on the E. We're very much focusing on the environmental side, but obviously the proximity between ESG topics, claims is very close and near, but sort of our focus is here on the E, bringing the strategic and result-oriented approach from the private sector into the NGO's mission. I start with this. You know these pictures. We all know the issues, and we see that these crises, there's a UN definition, triple planetary crisis, TPC, is all over the place, affects us. We hear the summers, we had the summers this year, last year, and we know the reasons. There are a broad awareness of the problems, which are mainly human caused. We know the science. We know the people sort of who represent the science and tell us, give us the data to give us this sort of, or the grounds for decisions, not only us, but also the politicians, but we still have that situation. So the big question which follows us between the past 3 years is how can we really accelerate impact? How can we make a change? We have sort of a societal problem which was faced. Environmental damage, climate change has obviously a direct impact on health. And we all know that big question, what can I do on my own? This is a societal problem. Individuals feel powerless to fight that problem, to stand up, to do something, which we regard as, I think, the core element of that present situation, that everybody is sort of feeling helpless. That again leads to our mission, which we defined when we founded Allrise, to facilitate the use of litigation and to develop large-scale climate-damaging climate litigation to do something against climate-damaging activities. And at the end, to set the grounds to then have a way for future prosecution of bad actors. This is very much driven with the thesis that I think the fight against climate change is and will very much happen in courts. The politicians, they don't deliver for whatever reasons. I will spare you with any politicians bashing. It's just a fact. It's not easy, I think, to be a politician, but hence the role of the courts, the jurisdictions is increasing and very important. And I think we need those courts to get those decisions, because we just can't follow the thesis of the politicians. Everything should be sort of on self-willingness. We need to change our attitude. So this is mainly our mission. And briefly explaining what we did so far as an organization. So we founded Allrise a couple of years ago. At the end, what we do is we develop climate litigation initiatives. We want the courts to clearly say, are we competent in that discussion or are we not? That leads me to our first case, which was briefly mentioned here, the Planet versus Bolsonaro. And it was simply the situation. I don't have to explain to you how that emerged, but at the end of the day, what we always wanted to hear and still is the ICC as the only international, or not the only, but sort of the main international criminal court, is it responsible jurisdiction for environmental crimes? As you all know, the ICC is built on the Rome Statute. It comprises the 4 crimes, crimes against humanity, war crimes, etc., but no environmental crime. There's a big discussion going on since years to add a fifth crime, ecocide, to the Rome Statute. But until then, the question is, do we wait until that happens, if it happens, or do we use what we have? And we decided for the second. What we have is crimes against humanity, hence we built that case, and urging the ICC to say, are we the competent jurisdiction, yes or no? If so, it has obviously an impact, not only on that case, but it has a deterrent impact on other bad actors, A and B. It might have an impact in terms of generating cases, claims on civil rights basis. And I will give you more explanation on the plan versus Bolsonaro, because it really shows, I think, also the problems I faced. What we did with the Bolsonaro case, very much is we left the silos, the lawyers, the scientists. So we put them all into one pot, more or less. The scientists had to work with the lawyers very closely. At the end, the result I want to show you to prove why we did that. And I think the legal work is as important as the communication work, for only one reason: we need to get the public on board here in that game. So that's the plan versus Bolsonaro. And the second thing, the second case we did this year, where we sued the Republic of Austria. The topic is soil sealing, which is a huge problem in continental Europe, or at least in continental Europe. Other parts of the world probably yes. So it's about sort of the concrete. Everything is being paved with concrete. We lose areas where we need it for food production. It has obviously a big environmental impact. So we sued the Republic of Austria and 2 counties before the Constitutional Court. We did that last May. The claim was accepted, and now there's a back and forth of statements. And yesterday we sent sort of a new package of information to the Constitutional Court. At the end of the day, it's a very unusual claim the Constitutional Court is facing here. And again, we want the Austrian Constitutional Court to understand or to tell us, are we the competent jurisdiction, yes or no? So it's always the same sort of pattern. Those 2 cases I was just briefly explaining are purely NGO based. So there's no money involved, as I would put it. It is criminal law or European law. But at the end, we want to see a decision by the courts. 1 second, I want to show you, can you hear that video? You just tell me. I want to give you that video because it really explains a bit how this campaign worked. And I said, I think it's very important to not only focus on science and legal, but also on how do we tell a story to the community, to the public, to onboard them when needed. Because at the end of the day, and I think we should be clear on that, environmental protection is also a question of majority. We need the majority of the people behind us, otherwise we won't lose, we won't win. We need them.
The Brazilian president, Jair Bolsonaro, has been accused of crimes against humanity over his actions in the Amazon in an official complaint lodged at the International Criminal Court in The Hague.
planet versus Bolsonaro.
The planet versus Bolsonaro.
Planeta contra Bolsonaro.
Planet versus Bolsonaro.
Planeta versus Bolsonaro.
Yeah. The reason for showing this is that just based on the numbers of the petition signatures, which was over 1 million, it really shows that the people are really, really interested in this. They want to be involved. And it's an answer to this first slide I showed, to the societal problem, because obviously anybody dealing with ESG claims can give, or is some sort of a platform for the communities to get engaged, be that financially, be that, giving a signature, or in terms of content and expertise. The young ones, all our kids, they live in that social media world. It was a big sharing experience, etc., for them. And suddenly I had the discussions at home on breakfast. So it's all about education. So when you talk about ESG claims, when you talk about climate litigation, I think we will talk about education, educating the people, and you always have to bear that in mind. Nevertheless, the interesting sort of these two projects showed us a couple of weak points. I summarized them here. Number one, and you probably agree, generally speaking, our poor environmental laws, the environmental laws we have in place, and that counts for globally, is poor, because obviously the laws we have are decades old or even century old. They were not meant to solve a climate crisis. They were more meant to, have an answer on car accident or whatever. So that needs obviously a great impetus from the lawyers and the judges to be creative. How can we use present law for other purposes? Which I think is the biggest challenge, and not only for the lawyers, but also for the judges. So Client Earth, everybody knows Client Earth. One part of their work is to train judges to understand how they can look onto law in a different way. They have a big project in China running, for example, where they train Chinese judges, which is really interesting. So that's a big no-go because we have a problem with these laws. Number two is too few climate cases see the light of day. As I said, they're very complex. You need a lot of science. You need legal expertise. It's very complex to bring those experts on board. So it takes time to do it. So you really need to develop cases. You can't replicate cases, or few, because there are so few precedents. Number three is that you have those great organizations like Client Earth, you have those passionate lawyers, you have those scientists, but what we don't really have is a working network, because you have those people in the rural areas of Brazil, as well as in China, as well in Europe. How do you connect those expertise? And that's really, I think, a big problem. There are a lot of sort of individuals out there. If you had the ability to combine them on one platform, or at least in a network, you would really leverage their expertise in a completely different way. Number four, it's still a question within the elite. We sit here, we discuss it. My father doesn't have a clue what's out there. He's 80. And he counts for, I know he's, an academic guy, but, he counts for the majority of people. I think, be it young ones, older ones, they are not integrated in that discussion. Yeah, no good. You need them. Number five, there's no funding to develop those cases, which is a problem. I'm talking about sort of those ESG cases, because they are so complex. You need money to develop them, and we don't have that, because the business model, and here we are with Nivalion. If I pitch an idea to Nivalion, say, hey, I have that company, they did that ABC thing in that area, can you fund us? And Nivalion would say, nice to have, but we won't fund an idea. Come back if you have a developed case. then I would say, well, the problem is we don't have any money to develop that case. So that's it's not a realistic discussion because there was none with Nivalion on that case. But Nivalion stands for me for the litigation funding business, which is a business for the past 40-50 years, very well developed. But that's not their focus. So we need a funding to develop these cases. That's sort of another problem. And number 6 is, and you're probably all aware of, that there is a lot of cases in the past years, especially in the past sort of 3, 4, 5 years. There are numbers of 2,400 cases as of today, but 90% of them are run by NGOs or organizations or private initiatives. They are donation-based. They are funded by grants, and the pressure is low. The companies, they smile at us because obviously their pockets are much deeper. So that's a big problem for the NGO world. And again, that's my experience of the past 3 years. I don't want to put that responsibility on the NGOs and other organizations because in my view, they will not be able to deliver. Hence, what's the solution? And for us, that's at least our approach. And the solution is for us is to build an ecosystem which is using and combining this private and sort of the private entrepreneurial tools with the mission of an NGO, as well as commercial elements. And that's very simple. I think the core element of, are we going to make it, this whole sort of situation? Yes or no? The core answer is yes, if the money is channeled in the right way. Very simple. If I can offer you can earn money by saving the planet, we're going to make it. If I can't do that, we won't make it. I think it's very simple like that, irrespective of all the necessities to educate people, etc., etc. But this is sort of our solution. And the way we are built is we have at the core a new co, which we are about to launch now in parallel to the NGO, which is called the All Rise Limited, which is at the end a vehicle to seed those projects. And we have like 4 focus. One is the All Rise Impact, which is sort of the NGO I was talking about. We have a vehicle called the All Rise Fund, which we are in the last sort of minutes before we're going to start our fundraising, where we develop commercial cases. We have an incubating arm, which we call the All Rise Public, where a third party can come and approach us and say, hey, we have an idea, be that a case, or be that something. And here we are with the 4th thing, the building blocks. Because if you talk about climate litigation, you talk about developing a legal strategy, but you also need certain instruments to build those cases. I'll just give you 2 ideas, which I will mention later on. One is a claimant onboarding technology. You need to identify the claimants, or a whistleblower platform. There are a lot of whistleblower platforms out there, but none are focused on environmental crimes or climate crimes. So there are a lot of building blocks necessary to build those cases, and this is sort of our 4th arm. The target group is, again, we need to be very inclusive in general, not only All Rise, but I think in general, we need to be inclusive. The lawyers won't make it on its own. They need the scientists. The scientists need the media to translate their data and message. We all need the investors to be capitalized, to be in there for long, etc., etc. So this focus is very broad because the complex is so broad. We need to bring in all these people necessary to deliver these climate litigation initiatives. A quick one on sort of the 4 arms we have. The All Rise Fund, again, is we are in the midst of setting up this early stage investment fund in partnership with a big UK law firm. At the end, systematically developing climate cases to the point where we can then approach third-party funders, for example, Nivalion, and say, we have a ready-made case. Are you interested to fund? The impact is clear because it has a commercial element in it, but we want to deliver social impact and impunity. And at the end of the day, if you look at those cases, climate cases. Very few are against companies because there is just not the capital to challenge those people. This all-rise impact, we have further plans. Obviously, there is one plan. We're in the midst of investigating the role of development banks when it comes to financing environmentally damaging structures. The biggest development bank is the World Bank. It's still the biggest financier of fossil fuel structures. So that's a very interesting discussion we have. We want to scale the soil sealing case, which we did in Austria, which was sort of a pilot project. We want to enlarge it or expand it to the European member state countries because they all have faced the same problem. Austria, again, is just the worst of all, but still the others have the same problem. And the systematic behind it is pretty simple. And I'm talking about European law, so that obviously counts for all the European member states. All-rise blocks, we have 2 projects in the pipeline, as mentioned. Well, we have 4, but 2 is here I want to mention, which is one, the claimants management tool and the whistleblower platform. You know better than I do that there is software and tools out there in terms of the claimants management, but that they're very costly, very inflexible. My background is tech, Uber, etc. I know there's other technology in place which is much more flexible, much more in favor to be market specific, topic specific. So that's a topic which we are dealing with, and the whistleblower platform, as said, a lot of out there, but none are really focusing on environmental/climate crimes. Yeah, maybe I finish with these colorful circles, and it's for me, it's more a summary. If we don't onboard the public, we lose. If that stays here in that Zoom room to save the planet, we won't succeed. I think it's very simple, and we need to be aware of that. How can we include the public? That's sort of number one. Number two, if this whole fight, the ESG claims, are based on donations, again, we won't succeed. We need to have a clear and good offer to the people out there to onboard private capital, the investors. We need to have a business case in place. And this is not a neither nor discussion. Yeah, we need those NGOs, and we need donations, and we need the grants, etc. But we also need the private capital. Number three is these building blocks. They're really important. If we have a good whistleblower platform in place, it can work, be offered, used globally by anybody. Yeah? So it's more of providing certain tools to the public so they can make use of it. That's, I think, really important. The open door for the community, I think I stressed a lot in this presentation. We need to be inclusive. We need to have the science in place. And again, the last one is really, we need to offer to earn money. I think if we are able to do so, we will win that race. That's in brief that. I think we have a great human opportunity here. We have laws, we need to enforce them. And thank you very much for your attention.
Many thanks, Johannes, for your insightful views and sharing your very colorful presentation. Quick remark for everyone that has joined later. Please feel free to type in any questions in the Q&A section, and we will be happy to answer them together with our speakers at the end of today's session. Our next speaker is Zora LYRA. Zora holds a Master of Law from Columbia University and a CFA certificate in ESG investing. Working as a partner at Barbosa law firm in Rio de Janeiro, Zora is a dual qualified lawyer admitted to practice in Brazil and New York. She is particularly skilled in the fields of corporate law, securities regulation, as well as corporate governance, which is exactly the cross-cutting area she will talk about today. Zora, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Simon. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks again, Lucas, Simon, and Nivalion team for the invitation. And it's also a pleasure to be here alongside Johannes and Andreas. And let me just share my presentation. I'm here today to talk about the role of the G in ESG governance, corporate governance, right? And the idea here is to talk about how securities law and regulation are connecting with the ESG framework. So corporate governance today, for some people, the G in ESG is just a rebranding of an old concept, right? That has been there for decades. But in my opinion, we're really seeing the need to redefine, a redefinition of the concept of corporate governance. Of course, that in its core, corporate governance is still about alignment of interest, about accountability, about systems, internal controls. But what I have seen is a change in the what's and the hows, let's put it that way. And why is that? Because of the focus now on E&S aspects, right? So what kind of information do we take into account? How do we take into account this information when, well, setting up internal controls or in the supervision role that managers have, right? And in my opinion, the importance of the G to identify and address E&S aspects is indisputable. Therefore, what we see today is that listed companies and other market participants, but we're going to focus today on listed companies only, are having to set a new strategy. For some, it's just a matter of risk management, risk assessment, while other companies really see an opportunity in the ESG agenda, and others are even changing their purpose, right, to adapt to this new reality. And while this demand comes from the market, I believe that policymakers must guide the way, right? What we are still seeing today, and of course, this discussion has been there for years now, right? It's a moment of uncertainty. We have different standards, several standards, constant changes in the regulation and, well, in the legal framework as a whole, but also, you know, in terms of voluntary practices, right? So we don't know what to see, where to look at. But I was thinking earlier today, but why are we talking about this, you know, today in this webinar series that it's quite focused on litigation, right? And why to focus on corporate governance and securities law and regulation? Well, it's quite straightforward in my opinion. It's because the G issues, you know, governance, it's often a cause and the legal basis for ESG claims and climate-related disputes, right? Well, in one hand, it helps the ability of the parties to adapt to new rules and regulations, and even to comply with these rules, right? And on the other hand, it also helps one to identify problems in the company. So it's quite easier if you have a robust corporate governance, you know, systems in place to identify what's wrong with this company, or even if you're an investor, it will be easier for you to understand what is going on and to set the right strategy. Will I engage with this company? Will I have to divest from the company? Will I, you know, sue? And who will I be suing in due time? So in the next slides, I'm going to focus on the Brazilian framework. I believe that, you know, not only because I'm a Brazilian, but Brazil has an international relevance. And for example, the Brazilian SEC, CVM, is always present in international forums such as the IOSCO, International Organization for Securities Regulators Commissions. And it also sets a good benchmark for other countries in Latin America, for example. And you know, it's also interesting to note that while, for example, in the US, we're seeing now a big anti-ESG movement. This is not a, well, in my opinion, at least, this is not a thing in Brazil. Right now, we are seeing a good alignment, you know, between the federal government, local governments, also, you know, in the market, looking at companies, but also at investors. So talking now about securities law in Brazil, listed companies are subject to two main laws, the Brazilian Companies Act and what we can call the CVM law, which is the law that created the securities regulator and also established its powers, right? And it's very interesting to note that they are from 1976. And back then, in the Companies Act, we already, the law already had the concept of the social purpose of the company, and also that the stakeholders' interests should be taken into account by managers, by the management, and also by controlling shareholders, when companies are carrying out their activities. And something else that I think it's worth mentioning, since we're talking about governance, is that the scope of fiduciary duties of officers and directors' fiduciary duties is changing. And I believe this is not only in Brazil, right? We're talking about this movement. It's actually, I think, bigger and faster, happening faster in other countries. But two examples here is the duty of care, in particular, the duty to monitor and to set up internal controls and to supervise, right, to internal controls. There is a shift in what exactly should be taken into account when setting up internal controls that are effective. And this shift, I understand that comes from the understanding that ESG risks are central. And of course, this is a case-by-case analysis, but for several companies, for different reasons, do have serious ESG issues that should be taken into account, and that should be analyzed by management. Well, not only management, but should be part of internal controls. And another example is the duty to inform. Well, companies and of course the management should be aware of what the company is disclosing, should always be aware of greenwashing, right? The potential to greenwashing. And this is a big thing in the US, right? The release of misleading information about ESG. And this is also a discussion right now in Brazil. It's still, beginning, but it is a discussion. And I would say that these discussions in my country are, it's quite interesting to note that they are in the Congress right now, right? There are at least 3 bills being discussed in the Congress, 1 on private enforcement and at least 2 on whistleblowers, incentives and protections in the capital markets that are seeking to enhance management's duties and responsibilities, and also quite related to, well, at least the private enforcement one, on the possibility of having class actions, the incentives of it, and the disclosure that should be given into proceedings that, are related to that. Unfortunately, we don't have much time to discuss in details. Lucas will agree with me that we would need a separate panel to go into details, right? So now about securities regulation and self-regulation in Brazil. I'd like to highlight that the Brazilian regulator, capital markets regulator, CVM, has passed in the last 2-3 years several rules that really tackle ESG concerns. And just like, well, in the US and other jurisdictions, the regulation in Brazil is focused on full disclosure and follows the complier explain model, right? So we have, for example, an annual report that we call reference 4 that has several mandatory information that needs to be disclosed regularly. And there has been, important changes in ESG disclosures. For example, now the companies need to disclose risk factors related to ESG. It needs to say whether or not it has a greenhouse gas emission inventory and the scope of the emissions that are, controlled. The compensation, the management compensation, if the company taking into account ESG benchmarks and targets, this should be also disclosed. And another example is whether or not the company has specific sustainability ESG reports. It's also interesting to note that, it's not here, but I would like to mention that the recently CVM also passed a regulation that it's complementary to the annual report on disclosure of proceedings, of corporate proceedings. And this is also very important, since the idea is to enable other interest parties, other stakeholders, and of course investors, the opportunity to understand if they do have, standing to join proceedings. And well, another example is related to public offerings and investment funds. Now public offerings also, if they're labeled, for example, green bonds, social bonds, they need to state that in the prospectus very clear, and the risks associated to that. Investment funds, same idea. If you want to use the label green, sustainable, you need to explain why are you using it, and there are some criteria that needs to be followed. Same for asset managers, and this is not only happening at the regulator, but also the self-regulator ANBIMA. But again, I don't think we have time to get into details about it. And I also, now talking about self-regulation, right? B3, which is the Stock Exchange of Brazil, it has what we call special listing segments. And well, basically you need to choose, you can choose whether you want to list in this specific segments. And for that, you need to follow a specific corporate governance practice that are the ones that in Brazil are we believe there are the best practices. And there's a whole discussion about whether or not the use of arbitration is a best practice for a company, for public held companies, right? And regarding ESG, recently the rules of these listing segments were updated to include a diversity element. So basically from 2025 onwards, companies will have to have one woman and one person from minority groups in its management, the board, or as an officer, or they're going to have to explain why they were not able to achieve this. And finally, I just want to mention that, the importance of voluntary practices in Brazil. We have several, such as the IBGC governance code, which set important standards in terms of corporate governance and plays a key role in Brazil to develop what we consider good practices. And this code was recently, this year, it was updated to include more principles on ESG principles, and new concepts such as the purpose of the companies, which is, I think, key for the discussion that we are having right now, and a good thing for Brazil. And I also wanted to mention the importance of international benchmarks and of DFIs. First, OECD just updated, together with the G20, right, the principles of corporate governance, and it included a section on sustainability with new principles again, and ideas on how countries should implement, and improve their corporate governance practices. And this again shows how ENS aspects are being taken into account in corporate governance discussions. And finally, and this actually goes to Johannes' point on the the responsibility that the World Bank and other development entities have in this ESG agenda. I would say that DFIs do have a key role in setting the bar, you know, quite high, because, well, I used to work at the World Bank, right? And it's quite different for a company or for, you know, a government to be financed by the bank or other DFIs. There is already a, you know, very well structured framework that needs to be well implemented by the company. And it's key that there is, of course, a provision and that this really is effective. So just wanted to highlight that. And so just to wrap up, the key takeaways that I wanted to bring today for you is that in Brazil, we see a shift in the focus of corporate governance discussions to include ESG aspects. And of course, this is not only in Brazil, this is everywhere. And well, again, for me, it's indisputable, the change. And the Brazilian Companies Act already addresses ESG concerns. There are bills being discussed in the Congress to improve governance. And there are recent regulatory changes tackling the ESG agenda. I mentioned just the CVM, the Securities Commission, but there are other regulators that are also doing the same, such as the central bank. So I think that's what I had to say today. Thank you very much. I'm gonna pause this presentation.
Many thanks, Zora, for presenting this interesting overview of securities regulation in Brazil and the role of the G in general. And finally, we're going to hear more about climate litigation from my good friend, Andreas HÖSLI. Andreas is a senior associate at the Swiss business law firm Walder Wyss, where he specializes in litigation, ESG, and climate law. He's had a strong interest in ESG and climate issues since his LLM studies in Sydney, and he's about to finish his PhD on corporate climate responsibility. Andreas, we are very happy to have you and look forward to your presentation.
Thanks so much, Simon. Thanks so much for the invitation, Nivalion, West Partners, and hello also from my side to everyone attending. Okay, so what I want to do in the next 20 minutes is to talk about this. That is no surprise anymore. What is that? Litigation in a climate change context has been on the news regularly over the last few years, more and more. A rather new development, however, is that this is not only directed against countries or governments, but against companies, corporations. And I want to speak about that, about the whys and hows of corporate climate litigation. One step back, this is a little graph about the development of climate litigation, both against in the public sector and private sector. That should just show you the trend. And it shows you this development has started roughly 20 years ago, and we have seen a sharp increase. And the last year is 2023. You might be surprised why the bar is so low. That is because they stopped counting in May. So I'm sure it goes up to more or less the level of the last graphs that you can see. So in general, the trend is clearly rising. It's also spread across many jurisdictions around the world. For sure, the origins have been mostly in the United States, and Brazil is also a dark green country here, and Australia, UK, and many continental countries, but of course, as you can see, many other countries as well. Now switching over to litigation, climate litigation involving companies. The numbers aren't extremely good, but my best estimate that of all climate litigation cases, 5 to 10% are against companies over the last, let's say, 3 years. and that share may be growing, but just in terms of numbers, most cases are still against governments, and we'll have to see how that develops. You can see here that claims, legal actions are filed against companies in all sectors, but there is an emphasis. The colors are a bit difficult here to see. That's from an LSE report of this year. But of course, the most obvious target is fossil fuel companies, and then also travel, meaning mostly airlines. But no company in no sector can say this is not affecting us at all. And here, corresponding to that, if you will, you see global emissions separated by industry sector. That's IPCC statistics from this year. And that makes sense that also most emissions are going back to the energy sector, but obviously also industry, agriculture is the dark blue one, transport and buildings. So that's just to say it's a cross-sectoral issue, and there are already legal claims in all major industries existing. So that's not the future, that's the present. This one is a bit also a preliminary remark, but an important one. This is a bit how this all started. That's research by Professor Heed, so-called carbon majors report dating back a few years now. These are the updated figures. What this graph shows you, the black bar, is industrial greenhouse gas emissions since the beginning of the industrialization up to almost today in total. And the red bar is they managed to allocate all, based on historical data, allocate all those industrial emissions to the 90 to 100 largest companies in the energy sector. So oil and gas companies mostly, but also building materials, including cement. So that shows you, if you look at those companies, actually most of the emissions can be allocated to them. Important, that doesn't include a legal responsibility. That is what claimants seek to establish. That's still debated in the courts, but it's just a fact and not even disputable that just based on historical production data, you can allocate a bulk of emissions to individual companies. So us lawyers like these definitions. What I propose in my research is to come up with a fairly simple definition of what I'm actually talking about. Private climate litigation, so these are proceedings before courts and non-judicial bodies. This can be, for instance, advertising standards boards or national contact points set up under the OECD guidelines that have a reasonably clear link to climate change, that are directed against a private actor, and accordingly, they commonly have their legal basis in private law. That's an important point. So you can usually not invoke, let's say, human rights. You can traditionally not invoke against a private company. That's the general view. Okay, now a bit the why. Why is all that happening? There are basically three rationales that, in my view, claimants in climate litigation base their claim on. So the storyline. The first is backward-looking, the graph I showed you before, just saying because you produced so much greenhouse gas emissions in the past, just because of your regular business, you have a responsibility to redress what the impacts of climate change. That's the first argument. Second one is forward-looking. It is very clear that if we want to have any chance at achieving net zero, which is net no greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, the business sector is essential, and we need deep reduction emissions deep emissions reductions in all sectors. That's from the IPCC. So without the private sector, it will not be achievable to limit global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is the goal of the Paris Agreement. The third, the present status quo. We are obviously dealing with a collective action problem. Everyone has contributed to it, continues to contribute to it, some more, some less. But who is basically responsible to clean the dishes after dinner? Yeah. And the problem of greenwashing and lobbying is another one. Another important development that I want to briefly point out is, as indicated, this has started mostly with legal action against states. It's a bit transitioning now to focusing more on individual companies. And even more recently, we have seen a few legal actions directed specifically against the directors and officers of these companies, especially in the US and also in the UK. And even this year, to my knowledge, the first case was filed against what I indicate here as a service provider, namely McKinsey, was listed as a co-defendant in a case in the US. So that's a very interesting development. You can see that across jurisdictions, US, Netherlands, Germany, France, etc. This is just a quick example that you can go through if you want to. Later in the Netherlands, which is very prominent in this context, first case against the state, in this case won by the claimants. Then against, more or less based on that, against the company, with success in the first instance in The Hague against Shell, obviously pending on appeal. And then Client Earth, which was mentioned earlier, tried to take this judgment to enforce it against directly at members of the board of Shell in the UK. So you can see everything is transnational, everything is developing really fast. Claimants need to come up with innovative strategies, which are unheard of. So it's an extremely interesting development overall. Similar in Germany, first case against the state, won by the claimants in the Bundesverfassungsgericht, Constitutional Court, and following up a number of lawsuits directly against mostly car producers and oil and gas company. Good. I tried to have done quite a bit of research over the last 3 years or so in this area, and I tried to come up with a bit of categories. I think the first presentation today, what Johannes was mostly talking about, was what I call here David versus Goliath cases. So that's a bit the one that you probably hear most about in the media on purpose, as we heard. So there, the typical plaintiff is a private person or many, supported by an NGO, but it can also be supported by municipalities. For instance, there's a case in France against Total, which is supported by the city of Paris and the city of New York. So the David is not always super small. That's an interesting development. There are also some cases where claims are actually brought on behalf of future generations, which is a legal discussion if that's even possible. The second category I call internal case, something completely different. There you're talking about claims brought by shareholders with a financial incentive, or creditors, meaning mostly in case a company goes bankrupt in any climate change related context, which has happened. So this is a completely different type of case. For example, also in a context of pension funds where beneficiaries are concerned about the investments that their pension fund is doing with their money, or the money they will be entitled to, etc. So very different type of case. And the third one I call greenwashing cases. There's typically also driven by an NGO, could also be a competitor, against the company criticized for its commercials, call it green fuels, etc. Or exactly. I will not go further into the details. My main ambition was to just point to these differences. Each of these cases is mostly novel. It's complex. We see combinations of these cases. And based on the type of case, the legal base is actually different. On the left side, you will probably most cases you use something in tort, whereas in the internal cases you will use something in corporate law, which is completely different type of case. And then the big question to be answered by the courts now is, can you actually draw on human rights? Can you draw on responsible business conduct standards such as the UN guiding principles or the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises on responsible business conduct? Is that possible? Can you take them and use them to interpret national laws? That's a very interesting discussion. Here you have some examples, and the last point I want to make is that it's not always about money. So probably we think always first as litigators when you're writing a lawsuit, what you actually want at the end of the text. You need to be very precise on what you want. Do you want money? How much? For what reason, etc. But it's not always about that. Obviously, in climate change, in my view, from a bit global perspective, the most important thing is climate change mitigation, at least in my research, meaning reductions of emissions. You don't get to reduce emissions. All adaptation efforts are in basically, futile if you want. So some claims actually demand a reduction in emissions, most prominently the Shell case. So that's a completely different type of case. And in the internal cases, can also be about risk management or, as Zora mentioned, disclosure. So these are very specific corporate law types of remedies. For example, you're a shareholder, a group of shareholders that's not happy with the risk management of the company you invested in. You can either sell your share or try to make the company better, if you will. In this case, by even going to court, if your discussions weren't fruitful, discussions with management. As you can see, most cases are still pending. That's on the bottom of the slide. And the next few years will be extremely interesting to see what decisions will be. So this will not. This will continue, and exactly the next few years will be extremely interesting. Yeah, I'll put you on the slide some further reading if you're interested. Otherwise, looking forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Very well. Thank you, Andreas, for this insightful presentation on the whys and hows of corporate climate litigation. And I think it's fair to say that the soaring number of climate change cases is very fascinating, and it will be interesting to see how these cases will continue to make their mark in board, but also court rooms. With that, I would also like to thank Johannes and Zora for making this webinar so insightful and sharing their views on how to seed fund climate litigation cases and the importance of securities regulation within the ESG framework. And before we turn to your questions, I would like to remind you of the next sessions in our webinar series. We will take a closer look at the costs of ESG business on the 18th of October, followed then by the 15th of November and the 13th of December, when we will discuss the intertwining of climate change and arbitration. But the very next date you should mark is already next Tuesday, when we will kick off this year's Nivalion Legal Finance Summit in Frankfurt that will focus on the rise of ESG risks. And with that, I hand over to Lucas, who will address your questions.
Thank you, Simon. Well, thank you also, of course, Johannes, Zora, and Andreas. It's super interesting how you coming from absolutely three different angles. Your presentations blend so well, and you know, you all are referencing each other all the time because it's a topic that has so many different angles where we can look in. As Johannes said, you know, there is no silver bullet here. he didn't use this expression particularly, but really, it's an all-encompassing effort from regulators, from courts, from shareholders, to NGOs, to investors, to lawyers, to media, and it's really a societal effort. And with that, I want to bring the first question that was written by Ayla Servaric. I'm sorry if I'm sure they pronounced it wrong, but thank you very much for the question. She asked, I would like to hear your thoughts on whether more standardized governance will bring about greater consistency and reliability in ESG reporting. And I will pass that question, of course, to Zora to approach the G element. Please, Zora.
Thank you, Lucas, and thanks, Ayla, for your question. It's a quite interesting question, and so to answer. To give you an answer, so I would say that the concept of governance is kind of, it has a subjective element, right? So depending on the sector of the company, the size of the company, the shareholders of the company, the size of the board, well, the how many lines of business it has, it will have a different corporate governance structure, right? So I can give you two different answers. I would say that the concept of governance, it does not allow for very straightforward standardization, but at the same time, I believe that regulators do have a big role in providing standards, and that this, yes, can bring better reliability and consistency in ESG reporting, right? So there is there's a limit to until which we can have standards, and this is actually part of the problem that we see right now, right? That's why there are different standards and different businesses and consultancy firms trying to set new standards, and discussions in international forums. It's quite hard, but yes. And the example that I provided in that B3, the stock exchange in Brazil, what it does, and also the self-regulatory bodies in Brazil, such as Ambima, they also have a great role in providing, standards and trying to, allow comparability, right? That's the issue. How you can compare different companies, how you can look at different reports and say, okay, this is better than that. This is, I believe that this is working or not. So, great question. Thank you. I hope I have answered.
Yeah, that's a super hard one, and as we lawyers typically say, it depends a lot, right?
Depends.
Right, but we have one from Patty, very specific question. I think this will go to Andreas maybe, but the others are of course welcome to chime in. It's from Patty, so the question is, if any of the speakers is familiar with the recent filing of a case by the state of California against the big oil companies, apparently on the basis of the companies being aware of the effect of their emissions on health and climate. It would be interesting to hear whether the case will be similar to the tobacco cases back in the day. The media has not mentioned the successes of the tobacco case as a precedent. Sorry. Any insights about the California case would be welcome. Maybe Andreas, are you aware of this recent development in California?
Yeah, I'm aware of it. Thank you very much for the question. I don't know the details of that case. I just read a bit on the news as well. Even if tobacco wasn't specifically maybe mentioned in this case, tobacco is often referenced as a bit the predecessor. You could also think of asbestos cases. Mm-hmm. And, I mean, it's not the first case against oil companies and will not be the last. I haven't read the details yet, but in in my preliminary view, it's one more case, against based on some cases over the last 20 years against big oil companies. So I don't think they will reference specifically to tobacco cases anymore. It has been much more developed climate litigation itself. So they have litigated that over the last 20 years in the US. But of course, in the bigger picture, somehow tobacco is a bit the reference, the historical reference in the past. Although in my view, I'm not always sure if everyone who talks about that has actually read the history of tobacco cases. That's just a side remark, but of course, a very interesting case to follow.
Yeah, probably because also it's a case filed by a state against an oil company, right? And as you rightly put, especially for these backward-looking cases, I think that the importance of this attribution sciences, this new field that seeks to apportion liability to a company given their historic emissions, is something for sure to follow. We have in the States, we have the famous case brought by the children in Montana. That's a case that was super worth following. And with that, I take the question to Johannes. That is, I think it came from Herford himself, directly from Israel. Is about your predictions, Johannes, before the ICC, not the ICC in Paris, the ICC, the International Criminal Court, right? And the Austrian Constitutional Court. Do you think that these courts will assume jurisdiction and rule on these cases? And he also asks about the timeline. And just maybe one small remark on this issue of competence. Maybe try to spice up the question and give you a chance also to put your views on this, Johannes. Is where do we draw the line in terms of judicial activism when we think about the judiciary versus our elected representatives? Where does the judiciary step in as a contra-majority power, right? To enforce human rights, to enforce the existent legal framework, even if under an updated view.
I hope I got the last one.
Yes, it's your question.
Well, just on the ICC, it's absolutely true. We filed 2 years ago, and they have not decided yet. I know the main reason was the whole Russian-Ukraine situation with Putin, but that's sort of been solved. I mean, there is sort of warrant out, I think in March or April, something like that. And then we know that they then started again to focus on all the communications. So it takes time. I don't have any timeline. I thought it will be end of this year. Obviously, we're going towards that, so I doubt it. I think at the end of the day, it's all about sort of how strong are we getting involved in politics. The ICC is completely underfinanced, understaffed. On the other hand, it's dependent on the member states. So you need to be very brave. And whether the present chief prosecutor wants to be brave in that space, I just can't tell. I think it's really important also in light of the very strong movement of Stop Ecocide, adding this 5th crime to the Rome Statute. So the ICC is in the light of the environmental crime discussion for at least 3 to 4 years now. In that light, I think it would be an interesting move to at least start a sort of an investigation. But the Constitutional Court, that's, I think, easier to answer because we have a pendant in Germany, the German Constitutional Court. They made a very stunning ruling in April or May 21, where they principally summarized, said bad environmental laws have an impact on all human rights, which at the end of the day will have an impact on the German legal system. So yes, I think we can be positive. On the other side, the Austrian Constitutional Court does not want to get involved in politics. That's what they say. But that brings me obviously to your third question. I think it's one of the major and main democratic rights to use the law to stand up against something. I mean, if you steal something, I can sue you. If you ruin my health by doing ABC, I can sue you. I have the entitlement to do so. So I think it's less a question of do we have the right to do it? It's more a question of are we having the environment to do that? It's very costly. It's very sort of intransparent for an outsider. So the legal system is definitely not very allowing external participants to use it. And that's a systemic problem. And maybe organizations like ours are mediating in between, and maybe we can help those guys to do that. And I would definitely be very much in favor of continuing this work and challenging those jurisdictions.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. This is super interesting to see how courts are, especially the international courts, they are, for instance, admitting more and more amicus curiae to bring in and make the society voice to be heard. And you mentioned the client turf example, and there. And they really understood, I think, or at least in my view, that they understood how the game works, in the sense that they are, from one side, as you said, they're training judges in China, because it's one thing to have poor laws, and the other thing is to have poor enforcement. Taking again back to Zora's presentation, when she was talking about the social function of the companies, this is embroiled in Brazilian and many other constitutions since the 70s. That's our legislation. And what changes is the social function. What changes is the fiduciary duty. What was to be an administrator in the 70s, in the 80s, it's completely different than nowadays. And then again, bringing back to client turf, they understood this, and then they filed a derivative lawsuit, right? A derivative action in the Netherlands. And of course, jurisdiction is always complex, and how far will courts meddle or enter into corporate governance or state politics. But not again to wave the Brazilian flag, but we do have some very, very interesting examples in Brazil, like the 246 article of the Corporate Actions Act that really fosters derivative actions by minority shareholders, by offering a 5% premium to that shareholder that, of course, will be, say, going up against, it's again a David versus Goliath situation, as Andreas said, but with a clear view of the financial elements involved. And it's really like that. We're discussing, I think, and maybe going towards a closure here, ESG elements it's not, I think this is not an ideological discussion anymore. We're way past this. If you are in the board of the management of a big oil company, and you do not implement a net zero transition strategy, you are very likely hurting your shareholders, because your company will not exist in 20 or 30 years. So with that, I think we can close the session. I'm sorry, I didn't want to talk that much, but this topic is very dear to us, to all of us. And I would thank you all so very much for the insightful discussions. I think everyone is taking home a lot of food for thought. Thank you very much to our attendees, and the debates will be then recorded. Thank you all very much, and see you soon, hopefully next week in our summit and in the next installments of our webinars. Have a very good day.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.